All right, guys, thank you so much for coming back to the channel today. I'm really excited to have a friend of mine, Michelle, on the channel. She is a registered dietitian, which you're really not going to find a lot of meat-based dietitians out there, but she has a really awesome story to go along with this. But we're going to discuss it, talk about it. Michelle, thank you so much for coming to the channel.
Sarah, thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, thank you. So let's just talk a little bit about you're a registered dietitian, doing carnivore. How did that happen?
Yeah. I guess, we can certainly start just when I became a dietitian. I became a dietitian back in 2008. And, my goal was to, I wanted to help people with nutrition. I mean, everybody, or I would imagine most people go into the healthcare field, like you really want to help. And, I had a history like of an eating disorder, and I wanted to, specifically help young people who were struggling, and I was also a long distance runner. At that time, I believe I'd only done 2 marathons. Now I've done 12 marathons. But I went into school as a dietitian, and you learn about the standard American diet. You're taught that you need all these grains, like fruits and vegetables are good for everybody. And yeah, protein is okay, but you need to have protein in, small portions, low fat. Sugar in moderation is encouraged. Sweets in moderation is encouraged. And there was such a disconnect, even as a young person, as a student, I saw things in the healthcare setting that, I questioned. But of course, you're new and you're young, but, I saw, we'd have people come in that would have traumatic accidents and they would have to be put on tube feeding. And you flip over the back of tube feeding formulas and you're like, the first ingredient is corn syrup, followed by maltodextrin, followed by soy protein. Are we sure this is good for people? And then I saw people come in the hospital with diabetes, and they were put on these consistent carbohydrate diets. So they're getting 75, 90, sometimes 100 grams of carbs per meal.
Ooh.
And the quality didn't matter. You could have a brownie, cereal, and a bagel, and we would just cover them with insulin. And, I would ask, like, this doesn't make sense to me. This doesn't seem right. And we'd, the longer you worked in acute care too, you'd see people coming back with the same issues. But once, the Academy of Nutrition, which used to be called the American Dietetics Association, is the governing board of all dietitians. And when I became a dietitian in 2008, the number one sponsor was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is not a sponsor anymore, but PepsiCo is, General Mills, ConAgra. And so, these guidelines don't necessarily reflect, health. So that was kind of like where I started to, have these issues. Like I'm not seeing healing. I'm not seeing people moving forward. And I'm seeing a lot of dietitians continue to advocate, like, all foods can fit and we need more plants and we need more fruits and vegetables. While that sounds really good in theory, what I found in practice was that wasn't actually helping people.
So you were just seeing so many people that continue to come back with the same issues or additional issues, and what you were supposed to tell them was just low fat, sugar in moderation. Yeah, and
Yeah.
plants.
And there's a myth, there's a myth, and I think this is a huge myth in healthcare, is that, we're told, like, if the patient would just comply, if they would just follow the guidelines, if you would just eat, brown rice and chicken and broccoli, you wouldn't be here and we wouldn't have this issue. But here's the deal. Most patients that I talk to, and of course there's outliers, right? But most people that I talked to were genuinely trying to follow the guidelines. They were eating fruits and vegetables. They were eating lots of carbohydrates, lots of whole wheat bread and whole wheat pasta. And here's an issue too. When you eat a lot of carbohydrates, as I'm sure many of your viewers know, you have that blood sugar spike and crash. And so people were constantly hungry. They were finding that they were constantly needing to snack and needing to eat more carbohydrates. But there was an effort, they really wanted to do these things, but these guidelines were actually setting them up to fail. Many people would lose a bunch of weight, they would restrict, or they would go on these, Weight Watchers or other plans, and they would come and they would gain the weight. Because as humans, we know humans, you cannot follow a way of eating that leads you to feel deprived. And as they were eating all these carbohydrates, all these whole grains, they were crowding out protein and fat. So they were constantly hungry. I had a lot of patients that were malnourished. It's amazing. I can't tell you how many obese, malnourished patients I've seen, which just seems to like blow people's minds. Like, how can you be 400, 500 pounds and be malnourished? But I had people that were so profoundly like over fat, but under muscled. They couldn't even, stand up and walk to the bathroom. And
Mm,
that's what you're constantly eating so many processed foods and not getting that, bioavailable nutrition.
wow. And were
So
you trying to
yeah,
follow that advice as well for yourself?
I'm sorry.
Were you trying to follow that advice as well for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a younger dietitian, I became a dietitian in my early 20s. I was also very active. So, I was eating a lot of carbohydrates. I was eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. And, for a while, I felt okay. My running was okay. I felt okay, but I had suffered with anxiety my entire life,
Mm,
and I had a very serious eating disorder when I was much younger. And I was just told, like, look, anxiety, depression runs in my family. Eating disorder thoughts, obsessing about food is always going to be part of my life. So I have to learn how to function with it. I have to learn how to be okay, constantly thinking, overanalyzing foods. And, there were periods in my life where it got a little better, certainly periods where it got significantly worse. But kind of like the big turning point for me was last year. Last year, a little over a year ago at this time, I started having just like severe muscle pain. My anxiety got worse. I wasn't recovering from many of my runs, and I didn't know what to do. Everything I had been taught told me that I was eating exactly what I needed to. I was eating lots of sweet potatoes and brown rice and chicken and, lots and lots of bananas and vegetables and bagels. And so, I reached out to what I thought were the experts. I consulted to sports dietitians, and they both told me I needed to eat more. I needed to eat more carbohydrates. At that point, I was eating about 350 grams a day. So they said you need to eat more. So I ended up eating 500 grams of
yeah.
carbohydrates a day, eating 8 times a day. And that, as you can imagine, didn't go well. I would try to go for a 2 mile run and I would break out in cold sweats. I was constantly anxious. I was waking up in the middle of the night with severe muscle spasms. I can't, started to feel really depressed, I don't mind sharing, struggle with suicidal ideation, something I hadn't struggled with in many years. And so, kind of the come to Jesus moment was I woke up in the middle of the night. It was about 2 in the morning and my muscles were just aching, and it was unusual because I wasn't running that much. I mean, I went from being able to run 15, 18 miles to, it was a struggle to make it through a 5 mile run. But
Mm,
2 in the morning, went to 7-Eleven, got 30 pounds of ice, put it in the bathtub. Here I am now, 2:30 in the morning, sitting in an ice bath, just trying to calm my aching muscles. Starting to cry. And my wife came in and was like, maybe we should do something a little different. And
yeah.
so, yeah, on time at that point to do something different.
Wow. So how did you come upon carnivore diet as was that the something different that you ended up trying, I'm guessing?
Yeah. So I was familiar with low carbohydrate diets and I was familiar with ketogenic diets. We certainly, you hear about that, but there's so much misinformation and fear mongering that I'd always assumed that, like, as somebody who's active, I have to have those carbohydrates, right? And as somebody, I even thought that, like, if you're diabetic, I mean, maybe you should balance your carbohydrates with fruits and vegetables and fiber, but you have to have them.
Mm,
And so I just decided, like, okay, well, if I'm not going to run, then why don't I try a ketogenic diet? Why don't I try? Because I understood fundamentally that carbohydrates didn't make me feel great. So I'm like, what would be the harm? And so this is when I started to do a little bit of research. I got online and I actually, originally discovered your profile back in, gosh, I want to say early August, September of 2019. And I saw, you and some other carnivore women, and you guys, you all look so happy and you have this beautiful skin. I was just like, they look happy and I am not happy. Like, but and I read about Sean Baker, but there was such a disconnect because I could get behind eating meat. Like, I'm like, okay, I get this. I validate protein, but all meat, I was like, oh, I don't know. And that really, everything I've ever been taught is that cannot work. But I did, once again, and I would encourage anybody who is curious, is do your own research. I mean, as I continued to research low carbohydrate diets, I was shocked by how much clinical data we have. We can get people off, 150 units of insulin in 8 days on a low carb diet. We can resensitize diabetics, resensitize your insulin and plasma glucose in less than 2 weeks. And when
wow.
I was working here, I saw people who've been diabetic for 20 years. And it's like, holy moly. And so, yeah, I just thought the extra protein would be good for my body. I said, hey, you know what? everything is inflamed, everything is hurting. Why not try this for a few weeks and see how it goes?
Wow. And here we are today.
Yeah, yeah. So the first my wife did not like this idea. Having coming from a history of a severe eating disorder, the idea of just meat, and that's certainly something that it's interesting. The Academy of Nutrition will tell you that all foods can fit, so you can't restrict. Restriction is bad.
Mhm.
And I definitely hear and validate that line of thinking, and we can talk more about that. But my wife was like, look, I'm concerned, like I don't know if I like this. But we kind of, after fighting about it, was like, well, look, you're an adult, do whatever you want. But 3 weeks into eating this way, I noticed that my muscle pain was gone. I had no more muscle pain. But I initially attributed that to, like, well, I'm not running. But my wife asked me, she said, hey, can you come sit with me for a minute? And so I sat down with her, and she said, I've known you for 11 years, and this is the best your anxiety has been in the 11 years that I've known you.
And that
So
was after just 3 weeks.
3 weeks, 3 weeks of,
Wow.
and because I decided too that I really wanted to do, I wasn't sure if I was going to be pure carnivore for ever. I actually, I just was hoping, like, look, all this extra protein is going to help my muscles.
Yeah.
But as I was eating, I was starting to find peace with food. I'd never had that. I'd eat a bagel or oatmeal, and like 2 hours later, I'm looking at the clock. I'm hungry. I'm anxious. I've got to, but I would eat, like, ground beef and butter. And it was just like, all of a sudden it's 2 o'clock. Like, oh my goodness. I wasn't worried about food. I wasn't thinking about food. And all of a sudden, like, I felt calm. It was almost like my brain. And obviously now that I've dug into the research and I'm writing my own book, I understand that, the neurotransmitters, and I understand, like, human physiology. But that's something as a dietitian that I just wasn't taught. Like, when I was working in acute care, I mean, I'm in there in the morning, and all the women are eating their, bagels and oatmeal. And it's like, oh, there's Michelle with her pound of ground beef. Like, that's weird. So, I was definitely considered odd. But yeah, 3 weeks. It took about 3 weeks to start to feel calm after that point. I knew I was onto something, and I became two things. I became excited and hopeful, and I became incredibly angry at the misinformation that I had been taught.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's so simple, it's just so simple, and where meat gets demonized, and you talk about the carnivore diet, and people just, like, their eyes kind of glaze over, or they call you completely insane. And it's like, but why not use it as a solution? Because we ancestrally, ate very similar to this. We would not eat tons, 500 grams of carbohydrates a day. That's not what we survived on. That's not how our species evolved. But it's like seen as so outlandish. Um, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because I get asked this question quite a bit, and I'm like working on a video in my head constantly to address it. But from your point of view, you're a dietitian, this is like your job, you're writing a book. I want to talk about the whole orthorexia thing, because that is something that comes up a lot, of like, you're a carnivore, you're orthorexic. I know that's like a loaded question, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think it's a question we need to talk about, because I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. When I was in treatment, I was, much younger, but for anorexia, there's a saying that, like, all foods can fit. You have to let all foods fit, right? Like, there's room for steak, but there's also room for donuts and cookies and Coca-Cola and all these other things. Because if you're cutting out a certain food group, let's say, you say, okay, I'm not going to have carbohydrates, or then that's considered restrictive, considered orthorexic. The definition of orthorexia being that you're obsessed, I believe, with, like, a healthy way of eating.
Mhm.
But I have to come back to, um, like, once again, human physiology and species specific diets. What are we designed to eat? And I think we also have to start asking ourselves, are these, if all foods can fit, are we 100% sure that these things are food, right? Is a bagel or a donut food? Is it something that if I put in my body, that it's going to nourish my body and brain? Can I live off it? Absolutely. I mean, we have studies that people lost weight off eating just Twinkies,
Right. Yeah.
can live off it. But is it food? And all the research that I've done, and we'll talk about this if people are interested in, the clinical, scientific. We can address that in the book, but also just, like, in very layman's terms, is this something that is going to, appropriately fuel my body and brain? And the answer that I found was no, it's not. It definitely doesn't. And the more people that I've talked to, they say like, oh, this way of eating is restrictive. I've never felt more free.
Yeah.
I've never in my life been able to function the way that I function. I shared with you before this, I couldn't run 2 miles a little over 16 months ago. I decided to completely give up. I wanted to be elite. I wanted to be competitive. And this way of eating gave that back to me. I just finished last week. I ran an ultra marathon, 6-hour race, ran a little over 44 miles, 44.63 miles, ranked number one in the US for 2020. Which may not seem too cool because a lot of races have been canceled, but I did look back and see that it also would have been number one for 2017 and 18. 2019, a world record.
Oh.
Than that. But even more importantly, anything, physical that I can do, like having that emotional stability. Anybody who struggled with an eating disorder, if you're very honest with yourself, the relapse rate for eating disorders is about 43%.
Yeah.
And that is going back into treatment, 43%. And about 20% of people remain severely ill their entire lives.
Yeah.
And if you've ever dealt with an eating disorder, the rate of relapse, like I'm engaging in behaviors, is 100%. I would imagine. Maybe somebody can correct me, but I know I've certainly engaged in behaviors. And so we have to ask, like, is eating this food really, or these things really food? Is it really moving us forward? Because let's say, okay, I want to say all foods can fit. If I'm eating bagels and donuts and cookies, one, we know on a physiological level what that's going to do blood sugar stability wise.
Yes.
But we have to address on a neurotransmitter level. There is significant clinical data, and we'll talk about this in the book, that when I eat a lot of those processed foods, it actually prevents my brain from engaging in neuroplasticity. What does that mean? The brain basically can't cope with stress and it can't adapt to new behaviors. So let's say you're struggling with binge eating disorder or anorexia and you're working so hard to heal. You're doing the therapy, you're doing all this stuff, but you're eating these foods. Basically, your brain can't rewire, it can't fix. You have to remove those things for at least a certain period of time to allow your brain to heal. And that's not popular. That's not fun. That's against all the, Kellogg's and Coca-Cola and all these people that want you to just, enjoy it in moderation. But unfortunately, that message doesn't work. And I think it unfortunately is hurting more people than it's actually helping.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. Every time that I talk with people about eating disorder treatments, I talk about my own experience with right before I was starting the carnivore diet. I was working with a nutritionist and I could not for the life of me stop binge eating. I was doing a mostly paleo diet with like a little bit of meat, like a lot of plants, but I'd find myself binging on like a bag of like this, organic dark chocolate, supposed to be like the healthiest dark chocolate you can get, but I would eat the whole freaking bag or half of it and feel terrible and like want to die. And I just didn't want to do it anymore. And so the nutritionist was like, let's, to stop you binging, give you one cookie a day. Let's put that into your meal plan, because I had a meal plan. I was doing all this freaking cooking all the time. It was so exhausting. And she's like, you're going to have the one cookie a day. And I just sat there. That's when I knew it wasn't going to work, because I was like, that sounds horrible to me. Like, who wants to have one cookie? Like, who does that? Like, and my husband's one of those people, I call him a normie, who can eat one cookie and be okay. But he's never had an eating disorder his whole life, that he's a normie, and so that may work for some people, but for people like you and I who have really struggled with these eating disorders, that whole idea of like moderation and all foods are going to work, it just isn't practical, because on a neurological level, it's like you're fighting with yourself and you don't have any quality of life, because you're so food obsessed. You're so obsessed with getting your next like treat. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to validate, I have people that contact me that say like, look, I'm following this high carb diet and it works for me. And you know what, once again, like you and I've talked offline, like we have no stock. Like if this is working for you, if you're metabolically healthy, you have no issues, like that is fantastic. But we currently live in a nation where 88% of people have some type of metabolic problem and 70% are overweight or obese. And unfortunately, I know for myself, like sugar in particular is a huge trigger, not only for continuing to overeat, but also having severe anxiety. And even a small amount, And, I've had people tell me like, oh, look at you, you're lean, you run, you can eat all this stuff. And when I was in my high carbohydrate days, I used my running as an excuse to, I can eat all these, cakes and stuff and cookies, but I couldn't moderate either. Like I could eat very large portions and I would be really sick. And it was this huge cycle where I'd beat myself up and I'm obsessed about it. And yeah, and I do want to say, like, as a long distance runner now, I do take in some carbohydrates. I'm not pure carnivore, but I feel like if we could back up, if as a dietitian, if I could have everybody back up, and if we could start with this foundation, if we could go back to meat and fat, get people on a carnivore for 30 days. Let's eat meat and fat and salt. Let's let your body heal.
Yes.
And then let's put out from there. What does your body tolerate? I've had people tell me like, I'm perfectly happy just eating the animal products. And I think that is a perfectly healthy, wonderful way to live. They're highly bioavailable and many people thrive very well on that. I've had some people say, you know what, I ended up adding in some carrots and some fruit. That's wonderful, right? This isn't a contest. This
Right.
is how can we heal your body, your brain, and how can we how can we get back to health?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I feel like a lot of carnivores are starting to act a little bit like too dogmatic for my taste. That has to be like, if you choose to eat carnivore, you have to do it forever. And I don't think that that's practical or really what everyone wants to do, but it's an elimination diet that can help you get back to baseline and actually do some gut healing, and actually get to a place where if you want to add other foods in, it's not going to cause, for some people who are super sensitive and have a lot of gut damage, they may need to do like probiotics and do like a gut healing protocol before they can start adding in other foods. But we don't want to, I feel like with the orthorexia thing is like, we don't want to demonize real food. We don't want to demonize berries. If you can handle berries and they don't cause you any sort of reaction, then have some berries. It's not the end of the world, but it's like such a fine line to walk in the carnivore space, because I do see some eating disorders definitely hiding in plain sight. That it's like they either are using carnivore to not deal with their eating disorder, or they're doing a ton of fasting and it's like always a new fast every week, and it's like, and they're like, oh, I'm trying to heal myself, and it's like, well,
You sure?
right.
You have to be very honest with yourself, and I think you have to that would be a concern of mine, that people would, and you could use any way of eating to hide an eating disorder or hide behind this. This way of eating, I think can pave the way for food freedom. It's not like you eat meat and fat and all of a sudden all your demons are healed. But I do think it stabilizes your brain and body
Yeah.
to give you the opportunity to start to work through whatever you need to work through. To heal from an eating disorder, often there's a lot of trauma or conflict or things you need to work through. But yeah, and I 100% agree with you about the dogma. Like, there's another group of people eating that does dogma. We call them crazy vegans.
Yeah.
They like to hashtag the carnivore diet all the time. Aren't they fun? That's a whole nother topic. But
Yeah.
truly, again, the goal is health. And how can we get back to health? And I do think we've spent so much time as a human race, eating all these processed foods. It's very, very rare that you find somebody that has grown up or has just been eating whole foods, right?
Yeah.
And so the carnivore diet, taking a step back, it does allow your gut to heal. I think that was one of the key things for me. And that's why I would encourage, I think most people could really benefit from that, just from the gut healing standpoint. Even if you're not going to do this long term, giving your body kind of, like you said, the reset.
Yeah.
I think that really helps, because I think, if you immediately try to add a lot of plants or a lot of other things, you may continue to have issues in some of those autoimmune reactions.
Definitely. And it's just funny, like we talk about this being so, I know we've already talked about this, but everyone's like, oh, that's so restrictive, I could never do that. And it's like, for me, I could be orthorexic eating a standard American diet. I did veganism for 2 years. I was definitely terrified of meat and what it was going to do to me, and eggs and all those things. I was reading all the propaganda constantly. I could find a way, in any type of way of eating, to be terrified of foods. And I think it's like you have to take a step back. Now you mentioned, and I want to talk about this, that you're eating some carbohydrate now, and I don't want people to be like, oh, well, she's not carnivore. Like we don't do that here. And it's another thing of like, you're a distance runner. You just ran a freaking ultra marathon. Okay. So maybe eating a high, just only meat and fat might not be ideal for someone who is extremely physically active. Staying carnivore for a while to allow your body to heal, allow your brain to heal, everything to stabilize, and then saying, am I able to physically do what I want to do, or do I want to add a little carbohydrate? Can we talk a little bit about your process with that? Because I think it'd be helpful for people.
Sure, absolutely. So when I, decided I wanted to heal my body and muscles and started the carnivore diet, I did just do, I'd meat and fat and butter, and I did keep drinking coffee. People have asked me that. I did, I did keep drinking coffee, but I wasn't eating any vegetables or any fruits or any type of carbohydrate. And then, when I started feeling better, I uh, basically came, I wasn't running at all. So I was home more. And I think my wife, she appreciates her solitude and alone time, was kind of like, maybe you should go for a run. You're kind of bothering me all the time. And great. I was like, because I put so much stock into it, and I loved it. And I wanted to qualify for the trials. Like the last time I had tried, I was, hurt and cold sweats, but I was like, all right, I'm going to go run a couple miles. I can just run for fun. You can't run long distance. You can't run fast on no or low carbs. And I went out the door and I came back an hour later. And that's when like the wheels started turning in my head. Like, can I run on a low carbohydrate diet? And so, I discovered Zach Bitter, who's the current 100-mile world record holder, who follows a low carbohydrate diet. And so, my wife was super excited. She's like, oh, you're going to be a recreational runner. It'll be so great. We'll go to different trails. And I was like, how about I run an ultra, like more than a marathon? God bless our partners that tolerate our crazy ideas. But yeah, so, I connected with Zach Bitter. He's my coach, and he made it very clear. He said, look, you've been a very high carbohydrate athlete for a long time. We got to take this really slow. We got to give your body a chance to adapt. And certainly as an endurance athlete, you want to be able to burn fat for fuel as efficiently as possible. I mean, humans in general want to do that. But, any of your people who watch, like if you're familiar with a marathon, like a lot of times people hit the wall where they run out of glucose or muscle glycogen.
I ran a
So,
marathon when I was like 21.
yeah.
Yeah, 20 years ago. And when I hit mile 25, I just busted out crying. I couldn't. It said you only have like 1.2 more miles to go, and I started crying because I saw that sign that I still had 1.2 miles to go.
You want to encourage you, and you're like, no.
I lost it. I lost it. The pictures of me across the finish line, I'm like ugly crying. So yeah, I'm familiar with that wall.
Well, because we only have a certain amount of stored muscle glycogen, right? It's very limited. It's really only about 20 miles worth, but we have tons. I mean, theoretically, you can run 4 marathons back to back to back and just body fat. Obviously muscle fatigue and stuff comes in. And so, I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to be a no carbohydrate athlete, at least initially. When we were running, we were doing, very easy 20 to 30 miles a week. But once we increased, like talking with Zach, I knew that eating protein, I could have gluconeogenesis where, the protein actually is able to convert to glucose, but it's a slower process. You also don't want to be using all your protein for that because you want muscle rebuilding. And obviously protein has other functions in the body, like hormone production, cell to cell communication, all that good stuff. And so that's when I was like, okay, well, it's time to add in carbs. And I was scared because I was like, oh no, I feel so good. And so we went back through, well, what can my body tolerate? And I think this is a great thing that people can do. I have this foundation. So I tried a little bit of blueberries, and that seemed to be okay. Had some carrots at night, and that seemed to be okay. At that point too, my wife was trying some elimination stuff. So she was trying, how about peppers? How about tomatoes? And I tried those, and those were also for me not okay. I tried some sweet potatoes, and I had not good. I tried regular potatoes. And so I was trying different foods to see how my body reacted. And I tried most of them a couple times. And it kind of came down to like, okay, well, my body really tolerates, carrots and blueberries. Great. And so I was awesome. That worked really well. I maintained about 50 grams of carbs a day for most of my training. But then when we got up past about, we were doing 70 to 80 miles a week of training. And I was also working and doing other stuff. It was like, okay, I need a little more. I just wasn't quite recovering. And then we discovered long fermented sourdough. And the process of making long fermented sourdough is literally takes about a week. It's got to set in the fridge, and then there's a day every 30 minutes. You got to move it. It's this crazy process. It's actually, I imagine, anytime we actually utilized grains historically, we soaked, we sprouted, we fermented to make them more digestible. And so now that's become a staple in my distance running diet, is that long fermented sourdough. And I know it'd be cooler and paleoer if I could tolerate sweet potatoes, but for me, I just found like this is what works. This is what my system tolerates. I have no GI issues. I'm feeling great, and it's simple. So yeah, my entire diet now. I just recently did a video.
I watched your "What I Eat in a Day" video.
Yeah, lots of beef, liver, the long fermented. It's pretty simple. It's not complicated. It's not, there's no like camel tears or yak milk or weird stuff, it's but I like it. I'm happy, I'm satiated, and yeah, and I've had a good response. I've had people, I was a little worried that people were going to be like, oh my God, blah, you eat some sourdough, but everyone's been pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think we have to keep on in this community. It's something that I really want to do in my channel going forward is talk about this orthorexia issue, talk about fear of foods, and like this, you're an ultra marathoner, you're an athlete, you run so much, and it's what you love to do, it's your passion. Meat gave that back to you, meat, the carnivore diet gave that back to you, so you're able to do that again. But there's no rule or law or anything like that that says you have to eat this way forever. That you're never allowed to have any plants or carbs or anything like that, if it's necessary for your body to function optimally.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, like, it's cyclical. Like when I say that, what I mean is there are periods in my life where, like right now, I finished the race a little over a week ago. I've taken 2 weeks totally off running. I'm zero carb again. I'm back to pure carnivore, because I think it's good to give your body a little bit of a rest. Yeah. And so I think that, so if you looked at my nutrition now, it would be different, obviously, than when I was running 80 miles a week. I think we have to be careful too, not to like, this is how I eat forever in all situations, right?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm like doing a super high fat version of the carnivore diet, but I don't know that I'll have to do that forever. It's what I'm doing right now because I'm undergoing a gut healing protocol, and I'm doing some other things to like heal my adrenals. So being in a therapeutic level of ketosis is very good for me right now. But what happens when you have, a channel and you have a book coming out now, and you're more and more people are starting to follow you, they think that they look at you one snapshot in time, one day in time, like your "What I Eat in a Day" video, and you're eating the bread. And they're like, well, that's what she does all the time. I'm going to copy that so I can have the same results as her. And it's like, no, you're not running those 80 miles a week now. You're back to zero carb carnivore. And so, yeah, we can't be so rigid with everything. Things in life change, our bodies change, chemicals change, and our bodies change. We have different stressors. Whether it's like exercise or just like hello 2020, like we're constantly changing. So our diet doesn't have to stay exactly the same all the time, and it's probably not healthy. I don't know your opinion on that as a dietitian, if it's like not necessarily healthy for it to be that way always.
Yeah, I think, metabolic flexibility is important. Resilience is important. Throughout history, we certainly shifted with like the seasons. There were periods where we ate a lot more meat and fat, sometimes for, months, if not years, when if it was really cold or there wasn't plants available. And there were times when there was more plants available, where we certainly ate, a little bit more probably of the fruits and roots and vegetation. Of course, back then it was small and very didn't have a ton, been hybridized and changed quite a bit. But yeah, I do think, and I think I'm not sure it's good for your mind either, and this is my own experience, to really say, I'm going to eat this way every day for the rest of my life. I think for me, being able to be a little bit more open and a little bit more flexible has been helpful, because when you go to different events or do different things, like, I mean, if I said, I'm only going to eat beef 3 times a day, that's it. Well, when we go camping and we've got sausage or eggs or whatever, right? So just being able to say, like, once again, it comes back to that foundation. you know, this is my foundation. I do not believe my foundation will ever change. I mean, like you said, this gave me my health back, and
Yeah.
it's changed everything. Everything in my life is better because of a high meat, high fat diet.
Yeah.
But also, I'm also, you know, flexible. I'm also okay. You know, my wife would tell you I put a little bit of a fight up. Like I had to eat more carbohydrates than I know I like to eat. I don't like to eat that many. It doesn't make me feel great. But for the very last stages of my endurance training, it was very important. You know, but in general, I think it's good to be metabolically flexible. It's good to be open. It's good to be but also, you know, kind of sticking to what works for you and what makes sense is also important.
Do you feel a big difference going back to zero carb carnivore versus having the carbohydrates, just physically, mentally? Can you tell a big difference at all?
Um, you know, that last week, because two things happen, you know, as you're going into a big race. So you're really pulling back on your activity. So, you know, you go from running 80 miles a week to like 20. And so I'm not running nearly as much. And then I'm eating quite a bit more carbohydrates.
Mhm.
And so I definitely felt a little bit more like I got a little anxious, got more energy. I don't know what I'm doing with myself. I think that's regardless, that's probably a little bit more of a lot of runners go through. You know, as I pulled back these last 2 weeks, I definitely feel more calm, you know, even though I think the mental clarity of a lower carbohydrate diet is really important and really powerful. And then recovery. I know, I mean, just for me, eating more protein and more fat, my muscle recovery is really quick. It's funny because I think too, a lot of times after a big event, you know, a lot of runners like, oh, I want to go, like, let's go drink beer and eat
Yeah.
garbage. You know, where I was just like, hey, at least those first few days, all I'm doing is meat and fat, you know, and you know, because obviously during the race, you know, you're taking in some sports fuel and some carbohydrates. Like I was actually really excited just to get back to not having to do that. So to answer your question, I definitely feel a little bit more calm and my muscle recovery was really good.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's so cool. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, are you seeing clients now? And if so, like, are you helping them with carnivore, or like, are you just focusing more on your book? Like, what's going on right now with your status as a dietitian?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so you know, I left healthcare. I left the acute care setting in August and started working in, you know, more the meat industry, working for a local company called Scratch Meats in Portland, Oregon. And I love that small group. We make, you know, homemade sausages, lots of organ meats and stuff. You know, a while ago, several years ago, I used to do one-on-one private counseling, and it's hard. One, just from like a business perspective, it's a little bit hard. There's almost no insurance reimbursement, and I found that I didn't love it, and I love the people, and I loved you know, some parts of it, but for me it wasn't what I really wanted to do. And so yeah, right now the whole focus has been on the book. You know, the book should be done hopefully, you know, I say most likely January 2021. And in the book I'll have, you know, I'm going to have over a dozen testimonies, and I want to have people that, you know, when they read the book and they read about carnivore and keto and low carb, there will be people that they can reach out to. You know, we have Dr. Robert Siwas, you know, we've got Danielle Hamilton, um, Amber Wentworth, Eve Fox, people that are carnivore coaches, ketogenic coaches, Mary, that people can reach out to. So I'm going to be the bridge to that, to try to help get people connected. But right now I don't do any personal coaching or dietitian clients.
Cool. Cool. Well, I mean, you just have to find what lights you up inside, what you're passionate about, and that ultimately is the fuel, you know. And it sounds like you've really poured your heart into this book to really help people, and I appreciate that. And you've got your own YouTube channel as well, which I was recently very honored to be on.
Yeah.
So I'll make sure I link that below this video. But how else could people find you if they wanted to connect with you or have questions? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, you know, I'd say right now the best way to get in touch is just through my Instagram. It's just all one word: run, eat, meet, repeat. I'll have a website pretty soon here, but that'll mostly be kind of like topics for the book. But yeah, I would tell anybody, if you have questions, please feel free to direct message me. It's funny, people will message me and be like, I hate to bother you, but it's like, oh, don't bother me. I love questions. And I'm so grateful. I mean, because you didn't mind that I bothered you, you know, years ago, you helped start my journey. So if I can be kind of a bridge in helping someone start their journey, Instagram's definitely the best way. I'm just started on Twitter. So Michelle Hurn RD on Twitter. Yeah. And then, as soon as I have a website, hopefully it'll be able to be searched via Google.
Cool. And I will link all that below as well so people know how to find you. But this has been really awesome. I'm really excited to get your book when it comes out. And I think this is going to help people a lot in so many different ways. Just hearing your perspective, your story of healing, and then just this message of just, dropping the dogma to heal your body, essentially.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you having me on.
You're welcome.